Behind closed palace doors, the royal summit turned into a shocking spectacle where cheers for Catherine and tears from Camilla set the monarchy ablaze. From the outside, the grand stone walls of the palace gave no indication of the storm brewing within. The summit had been announced to the press as a routine gathering of senior royals to discuss ceremonial duties and seasonal engagements, a predictable exercise in tradition. But those who knew better understood this was far from ordinary. Within the hallowed chamber, every glance and every breath carried monumental stakes, and the future of the monarchy hung in the balance. The air inside was thick with an unspoken tension, palpable enough to silence even the usual chatter of aides and advisors. The room itself, normally a place of bland formality, now bristled with an undercurrent of suspicion and quiet anticipation. Senior royals lined the polished table, their faces betraying nothing, yet the occasional raised eyebrow and shifting in seats betrayed that something extraordinary was at play. Even the most seasoned attendants, who had witnessed decades of royal drama, exchanged uncertain looks, unsure of what was to come. Then, Catherine entered, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. She carried herself with a calm poise that seemed to cut through the tension like a blade. There was no trace of nerves on her face. She was serene but resolute, every inch the figure of grace and authority. The eyes in the room, as if pulled by some invisible force, all turned toward her. In stark contrast, Camilla sat rigidly at the far end of the table, her hands clasped too tightly in her lap. Her usual easy smile was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a look of barely restrained unease. Even before a word was spoken, it was clear the stage had been set for something far more dramatic than anyone had anticipated. And then there was Sophie. Unexpectedly present, she quietly took her seat beside William, leaning toward him to whisper something that made his jaw tighten ever so slightly. Whatever she said was enough to spark a faint but noticeable ripple of whispers among the aides nearby. Her presence alone added another layer to the mystery. She was not scheduled to attend, yet here she was, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. The tension only deepened as she exchanged knowing glances with Catherine, while Camilla's eyes narrowed in suspicion. As the meeting formally commenced, there came an unsettling silence, followed by the faintest sound of paper shuffling and the click of a pen against the table. It was then that the words "surprise agenda" were uttered. The phrase landed like thunder in the room. Camilla's eyes widened, and she shifted uncomfortably, while Catherine's expression remained serenely unbothered. Those two words hung heavy in the air, sending murmurs through the ranks as if confirming everyone's worster, perhaps greatest suspicions. Every pair of eyes seemed to gravitate back to Catherine, as though the very weight of the monarchy had settled on her shoulders at that moment. The murmurs grew louder, whispers of coup and change, echoing softly, yet unmistakably, through the cavernous hall. Camilla's gaze darted nervously from face to face, realizing too late that the room was no longer hers to command. But what began as quiet admiration for Catherine soon erupted into a royal reckoning no one dared predict. While Catherine blossomed in public, Camilla waged a silent war behind the scenes until her plans crumbled in front of everyone. Beneath the polished surface of royal engagements and carefully choreographed appearances, Camilla's insecurities festered quietly, like cracks beneath a marble floor. For years, she had watched Catherine ascend with grace, winning the hearts of the public, the admiration of the staff, and, most dangerously, the confidence of the family. What began as a faint worry had grown into an unrelenting fear, the fear of being overshadowed, erased from history before she could even cement her place within it. To counter this looming threat, Camilla embarked on a campaign so subtle that few noticed it at first. She sought to shore up her position in private, arranging quiet audiences with key advisors and dropping strategic comments designed to undermine Catherine's perceived readiness. Allies, she thought loyal, were tasked with spreading doubts about Catherine's temperament, her health, even her motives. But these efforts, though persistent, bore an unmistakable edge of desperation, revealing just how threatened she felt. Then came the whispers too loud to remain contained. Letters, allegedly penned by Camilla herself, were said to have landed on Charles's desk weeks before the summit, warning him that Catherine was overstepping, encroaching on duties that were not yet hers to claim. These letters, though intended to sway Charles in her favor, only added fuel to the simmering tension. Aides began exchanging knowing looks in corridors, and murmurs of discontent grew louder among staff who had long been loyal to Catherine. The letters were leaked in fragments, and though never publicly confirmed, the timing was impossible to ignore. Behind the scenes, tense meetings unfolded where Camilla cornered aides, demanding explanations for Catherine's rising influence. She scolded one secretary so harshly that he reportedly requested reassignment. To her dismay, even her inner circle began to shrink. What she failed to see was how her defensive maneuvers only exposed her vulnerabilities further, making it clear she was fighting a battle she no longer had the strength to win. For all her outward defiance, the tight smiles, the cold glances, the rehearsed composure, Camilla's emotional fragility had begun to show through the cracks. Alone in private moments, she was said to break down, questioning why she was being cast aside so easily. But there was no stopping the tide now. Meanwhile, Sophie and William worked in quiet unison, almost imperceptibly gathering allies in Catherine's corner. In hushed conversations and subtle nods during engagements, they weaved a web of support strong enough to withstand Camilla's last-ditch efforts. The closer the summit drew, the more obvious it became that the silent campaign she had waged was not protecting her, but isolating her. And as the summit progressed, it became clear that Camilla's quiet maneuvers had only fueled the storm gathering around her. With one sentence, Sophie silenced the room and shattered Camilla's composure beyond repair. The moment came without warning, as though history itself had held its breath and finally exhaled. In a hall dominated by whispers and apprehension, Sophie rose slowly from her seat, defying every protocol written into the royal code. Heads turned sharply, and even Catherine appeared momentarily caught off guard. Camilla froze, her eyes narrowing in disbelief, as Sophie adjusted the papers in her hand and cleared her throat. No one had expected Sophie to speak, let alone command the room with such quiet ferocity. What followed was not a mere speech but a declaration bold, reverent, and dripping with both admiration and quiet defiance. Sophie began by acknowledging Catherine not simply as a royal but as the embodiment of duty and grace. She spoke of how Catherine had, time and again, carried the weight of the monarchy on her shoulders, choosing service over self, dignity over ambition. Her words cut through the air like a blade wrapped in silk, reminding everyone present that true leadership does not roar. Then Sophie did something even more unexpected. She recounted private moments, memories that had never been shared publicly, intimate glimpses of Catherine inspiring the family when all seemed lost. How she had comforted the Queen during her final days, how she stood firm through scandals, how she quietly held the family together in ways that few could see but everyone felt. Each story Sophie told chipped away at the facade of rivalry that Camilla had so carefully built, replacing it with something undeniable: respect for Catherine's quiet power. But it wasn't all praise. Hidden within Sophie's words was a veiled critique, sharp enough to draw blood. Without ever naming her, Sophie alluded to the divisiveness of ambition, the danger of placing oneself above the institution, and the cost of sowing discord for personal gain. The implication was impossible to miss, and Camilla visibly stiffened, her jaw tight, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. The entire room could feel the weight of Sophie's rebuke pressing down on them, impossible to escape. And then came the words that broke the silence and ignited the storm. Sophie's voice grew steady, and with a final glance at Catherine, she said what no one else had dared to. "She's our queen." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before the room erupted in applause. Advisors and royals alike joined in, their clapping echoing off the walls, drowning out the faint sound of Camilla's breath catching in her throat. As the ovation grew louder, Camilla's composure crumbled. Tears glistened in her eyes, though she tried desperately to hide them, her lips pressed into a thin line as she fought to contain her humiliation. The approval that surrounded Catherine was overwhelming now, leaving Camilla adrift, her years of maneuvering undone in a single sentence. As Sophie took her seat, the weight of her words hung in the air, and Catherine's destiny seemed sealed. For years, Catherine bore the weight of silent battles, but this moment crowned her not just in name, but in spirit. What unfolded in the summit that day was not merely a public show of support, but the culmination of a journey defined by endurance, humility, and unyielding strength. Catherine's path to the center of the monarchy had been anything but easy. From her earliest days as an outsider, she had learned to navigate sharp glances and whispered doubts, walking a fine line between duty and self-preservation. She endured not because she was immune to pain, but because she knew that the only way to rise was to remain unshaken, no matter how fierce the storm. There were moments along that path she would never forget. Late at night, alone in her room after exhausting engagements, quiet tears fell as she silently questioned whether she truly belonged. The first years were riddled with bruising gossip, with Camilla's dismissive gestures in public settings cutting deeper than anyone realized. Catherine would offer a smile and bow her head in deference, but behind the mask, she felt the sting of being constantly underestimated, treated as though her presence was conditional. Those memories lingered even now, but they only sharpened the significance of this moment, the summit, where her quiet resilience transformed into undeniable power. As Sophie spoke, Catherine's poise was its own kind of speech. Every word Sophie uttered about her seemed to reflect in the way she sat, calm, composed, almost regal in her silence. The contrast between her stillness and Camilla's escalating distress could not have been more stark. There was symbolism in her restraint, in her refusal to gloat or visibly react. She embodied dignity, proving that true strength does not clamor for attention, it simply commands it. At one point, William turned toward her, and their eyes met in an exchange that spoke volumes. No words passed between them, but the unspoken resolve was unmistakable. This was their moment. In that fleeting glance was a pact, an acknowledgement of everything they had weathered to reach this point, and a promise that they would carry the crown together, regardless of what came next. When Sophie finally sat, the room waited for Catherine to speak, and she did softly, but with an authority that quieted even the whispers in the corners. She expressed gratitude without arrogance, humility without weakness. Her words were measured yet firm, acknowledging the support of the family while affirming her readiness to serve. It was a delicate balance of deference and command, and it landed perfectly, disarming even those who had doubted her just moments before. The applause that followed was more than polite formality. It was charged, emotional, almost cathartic, as though everyone present understood that they had witnessed not only the passing of a torch, but the rise of a monarch in spirit. And in that applause, Catherine's grace under pressure became her crowning glory, solidifying her role in the eyes of all who mattered. Yet beneath the cheers, Camilla's tears hinted at deeper fractures waiting to rupture. For all her scheming, Camilla never imagined her downfall would come so swiftly or so publicly. The applause that crowned Catherine's quiet triumph still echoed through the room when Camilla's mask began to crack. Until now, she had clung to the illusion of control, believing she could outmaneuver Catherine and silence Sophie with carefully timed whispers and veiled threats. But the force of what she had just witnessed left her visibly unmoored, stripped of her defenses and unable to disguise the devastation creeping into her expression. Every cheer for Catherine was another blow, and every approving glance Sophie received chipped away at the image Camilla had so meticulously constructed. Her unraveling was quiet at first, a subtle shift in posture, a tremor in her fingers as they clenched at the tablecloth, her eyes darting between the faces around her in search of even a flicker of support. But there was none. With growing desperation, she leaned closer to Charles, her voice barely above a whisper, pleading for him to step in, to say something, anything, that would remind the room who she was. But Charles, ever the master of appearances, brushed her aside with the cold detachment of a man unwilling to expose his own conflict before a watching audience. His eyes stayed forward, his jaw set, as though her words had never reached him at all. The rejection left her breathless, and a dangerous silence settled over her. Then came the glares, daggered glances, hurled at Sophie and Catherine, sharp enough to cut. She didn't speak, but her fury was evident, her disdain unmasked as she sought to wound them with nothing more than her gaze. Yet even this act of defiance fell flat, swallowed by the reverence that surrounded the two women she now saw as rivals she could no longer defeat. Aides standing at the edges of the room could not help but notice the small, telling details, the way her hands shook slightly, how she clutched her napkin as though it were a lifeline, and the sheen of moisture in her eyes that betrayed her resolve. One aide even whispered later that her breathing had become uneven, her shoulders rising and falling too quickly, as though she was trying to hold back the tide of humiliation threatening to consume her entirely. Then, without warning, she pushed back from the table. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor sliced through the applause, still fading from Sophie's speech. A collective gasp rose from the room as Camilla stood abruptly, her face pale but set with a final, bitter resolve. All eyes followed her as she turned toward the door, shoulders rigid, the fabric of her dress whispering with every hurried step. For a moment, it seemed as though no one dared move. It was William who broke the silence, his voice calm but edged with authority, as he rose just enough to urge the room to remain composed. He exchanged a pointed look with the aides by the door, signaling them to keep the press at bay, though even he knew that whatever happened next could not be contained for long. But as Camilla fled the room, the palace walls seemed to shake under the weight of secrets still left unsaid. With Camilla gone, the summit pivoted to the future, and Catherine's destiny was revealed in full force. The heavy doors had barely closed behind Camilla when the room fell into a hushed stillness, the kind that carried both relief and dread. All eyes shifted to Charles, who remained seated at the head of the table, his expression somber but determined. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the silence itself underscore the gravity of what was about to unfold. Then, slowly, he rose to his feet, the weight of decades of mistakes, burdens, and unspoken truths pressing visibly upon him. When he finally spoke, his voice wavered at first, betraying emotion he could no longer conceal. He began not with authority, but with humility, admitting, before them all, that he had erred, that he had allowed his judgment to falter, and in his own insecurity, he had overlooked the one person who had never once faltered, Catherine. His words landed heavy, each syllable carrying both confession and absolution, as though he himself had been waiting years to speak them. Then, almost as if choosing to unburden himself completely, Charles made a cryptic remark that brought the room to full attention. He said that today was not simply about what he felt, but about honoring the Queen's private wish, a wish she had entrusted to him alone. The phrase sent a ripple through the gathering, the subtle implication that Catherine's ascendancy had been foreseen and perhaps even preordained long before any of them could have imagined. And then came the moment no one could have prepared for. With deliberate care, Charles reached for a small, velvet-lined box resting before him. As he opened it, the contents rumored to include jewels once belonging to Diana herself shimmered faintly in the dim light. Without a word, he extended it to Catherine, who accepted it with a quiet, breathless resolve. The symbolism was undeniable. In that gesture, he was not merely handing her heirlooms but an unspoken acknowledgement that the crown's future now rested squarely on her shoulders. Applause rose slowly, then swelled into something far more powerful. It was not the polite clapping of protocol, but a deep, emotional release approval that transcended words. The tension of the day dissolved into a collective affirmation as Charles looked directly at Catherine and with a voice that carried across the hall declared, "She's our queen, in every sense." For the first time that day, Catherine allowed herself the faintest smile, not of victory but of understanding. Around her, faces softened, some eyes welled, and the room that had once been so divided now felt momentarily united in a vision that none could deny. And yet, even as the summit reached this climactic resolution, the absence of Camilla hung in the air like a final curtain, calling her silence more deafening now than any words she could have spoken. But outside the grandeur of the summit, the public's reaction promised to escalate the royal drama even further. When the news broke, streets erupted, and the people's cries crowned Catherine before any coronet could. By the time the summit doors closed, and the echoes of Charles's declaration still lingered inside, the outside world had already begun to shift. Within hours, headlines screamed of the moment Catherine was called "Our Queen" by the monarch himself. The media descended like hawks, cameras flashing, commentators breathless, struggling to keep pace with the magnitude of what had unfolded behind palace walls. Every channel carried the story, every paper rushed to print. And as the details leaked Sophie's thunderous speech, Camilla's tearful exit, the passing of Diana's jewels, the narrative took on a life of its own, electrifying the nation. Crowds began to swell outside royal residences almost immediately, their chants growing louder with each passing minute. They called Catherine's name, some voices breaking with emotion, others with defiance. They raised placards scrawled with words of praise, and when the gates opened just a crack to admit another car, they surged forward, desperate for a glimpse of the woman they now saw as the true heart of the monarchy. Even in the cold, they stayed, waiting, singing, filling the air with a raw, collective longing for something that felt like justice and redemption at once. As night fell, Emotional testimonials began to circulate clips of elderly women recounting how Catherine reminded them of the Queen's quiet strength, of young mothers speaking through tears about how she carried herself with grace and dignity no matter how heavy the crown of expectation had grown. Men, women, children alike seemed united in their recognition of something profound, that the monarchy they had grown weary of had, in Catherine, found its soul again. Even those who had once written cruel headlines, who had painted Catherine as timid, cold, or out of her depth, now scrambled to rewrite their stories. Tabloids that once mocked her silence now lauded her poise. Critics who had questioned her devotion now marveled at her resilience. One particularly vicious columnist who had once called her a shadow princess published an op-ed titled simply, "She's Our Queen." But for Camilla, the public's roar was merciless. Footage of her tearful retreat was replayed endlessly, and every frame seemed to magnify her defeat. Commentators dissected her every move with brutal clarity, turning sympathy into scrutiny. By the next morning, her public standing had crumbled completely, her name now spoken in the same breath as bitterness and ambition undone. Then, in a moment that crystallized everything, Sophie and William stepped out from the palace gates flanking Catherine, their faces solemn but unmistakably proud. The cheering surged into deafening applause, a thunder of voices calling out in unison as Catherine raised her head slightly, her hands clasped before her. For once, the noise wasn't just for the institution, it was for her. Yet, even amidst the jubilation, whispers inside the palace hinted at one final twist yet to come. Just when the dust seemed to settle, an old letter from Queen Elizabeth surfaced, rewriting everything once more. The applause outside the palace gates still thundered when whispers began to snake through the corridors inside. Among the staff, one quiet word kept recurring, passed from aide to aide like a dangerous secret: the letter. At first, it seemed too extraordinary to believe, another rumor born from the chaos of the day. But the truth could no longer be denied when a trusted chamberlain emerged carrying a thin, ivory envelope with the Queen's familiar crest, sealed decades ago yet perfectly preserved. Addressed in the Queen's unmistakable hand, the letter bore only one name: Catherine. Its discovery shocked even those closest to the inner circle. Some wondered if it had been misplaced, others if it had been hidden deliberately, but none could deny its timing. Word spread quickly that this letter had been left in trust, to be delivered only when the monarchy reached a crossroads. And now, after Camilla's exit and Catherine's ascendancy, the moment had arrived. What lay inside was far more than ceremonial platitudes. The Queen's words were personal, almost intimate, carrying the weight of wisdom forged over a lifetime. She spoke of watching Catherine grow into her role, of seeing in her the same quiet resolve she herself had relied on when she wore the crown. She confessed to having long ago chosen Catherine privately, silently as the future queen in spirit, knowing she would never say so aloud. And then, in a line that silenced the room when it was read aloud to Charles and William, the Queen had written, "When the time comes, you'll know because they'll say it themselves, she's our queen." It soon became clear that Sophie, more than anyone, had known of the letter's existence all along. Those who recalled her confidence during the summit, her unwavering praise of Catherine, now understood the source of her certainty. The revelation explained why she had dared to confront Camilla so directly, why her words had struck so deep. Sophie had not been speaking from the opinion she had been delivering the Queen's unspoken will. Even more stunning, accounts emerged that Camilla had been shown the letter privately before she left the summit. A senior aide revealed she had been summoned into a side chamber where the contents were read to her, her face paling, as each word unraveled the last threads of her composure. It was, many believed, the final blow, the undeniable proof that no amount of scheming could ever rewrite what the Queen herself had written. Later, after the crowds dispersed, Catherine was seen alone, holding the letter. One witness swore they saw her wipe away a single tear, her head bowed, her lips moving as if she were whispering thanks to the woman who had paved the way for her. And so, as the monarchy entered a new chapter, the echoes of that summit and those 4 words continued to reverberate through history. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.